Plato once said, "Music is wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and charm and gaiety to life, and to everything." God has created music similar to certain beauty, the beauty of creation, like the redwoods or the turquoise Mediterranean waters and the northern lights. Music begs us to stop everything and pay attention. Welcome to our annual Fall Hymn Fest. We are so pleased and so happy to see so many of you and that you're sharing your Sunday afternoon with us. Hymns have played a vital role in worship since the earliest Christians gathered to worship. The word hymn derives from the Greek word hymnus, which means a song of praise. The singing of hymns is called hymnody. Hymns provide so much to our Christian life and worship. Hymns help us praise God. They unite the Lord's earthbound church in heavenly harmony. Hymns help us to pray. Sometimes when we're too wearied or worried for words, a hymn like "Be Still My Soul" or "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" provides comfort and strength. Hymns give us a way of talking to ourselves, providing encouragement and peace. And finally, hymns connect us with generations now gone. We hope that the origins of the hymns provide a deeper understanding and appreciation of these hymns every time they are sung. Knowing who wrote the words, what occasion prompted the writing, and how the music was composed makes these beautiful hymns a more vital spiritual force in our lives. Charles Wesley wrote 8,989 hymns. He wrote an average of 10 lines of verse over 50 years. He completed a poem every other day. John and Charles Wesley published 56 collections of hymns in 53 years. Charles was an accomplished field preacher who on occasion addressed 10,000 to 20,000 people. He experienced considerable opposition, sometimes from rock-throwing mobs. 18th century hymn books were usually celebrations and collections of texts. They did not include musical notes. The first American hymnal to join tunes with text was not published until 1831, and the singing of hymns was not officially approved in the Church of England until 1820. Throughout Charles Wesley's life, his Methodist companions sang none of his hymns in Sunday worship. They remained in the Anglican Church, which did not employ the new hymns in worship. His hymns were sung in informal Methodist gatherings during the week. In closing, in the words of Walter Lander, music is God's gift to man and the only art of heaven given to earth, and the only art on earth we take to heaven. We are going to stand for 4 hymns during the service, just to allow you not to have to go up and down so many times. And the first one will be our opening one that Bob is going to be talking to us about. And I will tell you when to stand for the others, okay? Thank you again.
Our first hymn this afternoon is "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." It's one of my favorites. It was written by Martin Luther in 1529. We think of Martin Luther as a great reformer, but he was also a musician, having been born in an area of Germany known for its music. There in his village, the young Martin grew up listening to his mother sing. He joined a boys' choir that sang at weddings and funerals. He became proficient with the flute or recorder, and his volcanic emotions often erupted in song. When the Protestant Reformation began, Luther determined to restore worship to the German church. He helped revive congregational singing and wrote a number of hymns. Once he borrowed popular secular melodies for his hymns, though occasionally a tune brought criticism and he was compelled to let the devil have it back because it was too closely associated with bars and taverns. Luther once wrote, "Next to the Word of God, the noble art of music is the greatest treasure in the world. It controls our thoughts, minds, hearts, and spirits. A person who does not regard music as a marvelous creation of God does not deserve to be called a human being. He should be permitted to hear nothing but the braying of asses and the grunting of hogs." Luther's most famous hymn is "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," based on Psalm 46. It reflects Luther's awareness of our intense struggle with Satan. In difficulty and danger, Luther would often resort to this song. This is a difficult hymn to translate because the original German is so vivid. At least 80 English versions are available. The most popular in America was done by Frederick Henry Hodge. An older version appeared in the Pennsylvania Lutheran Church Book of 1868. "A mighty fortress is our God, a trusty shield and weapon. He helps us free from every need that hath us now o'ertaken."
Yeah. The next hymn is Precious Lord, Take My Hand from 1932. Deuteronomy 31:6 reads, Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Some people think this great old gospel song was written by the famous big band leader Tommy Dorsey. It wasn't. The author was named Thomas Andrew Dorsey, and he was the son of a black revivalist preacher. Thomas was born in a small town in Georgia in 1899. When he was 11, he moved to Atlanta and fell in love with the blues. He began playing piano at Vaudeville Theater, and later the family moved to Chicago, where he attended classes at the College of Composition and Arranging. Soon he was on stage under the name Georgia Tom, playing barrel house piano in one of Al Capone's Chicago speakeasies and leading jazz bands. Thomas was converted at the National Baptist Convention in Chicago in 1921 and began writing gospel songs and trying to get them published. It was discouraging at first. He later said, I borrowed $5 and sent out 500 copies of my song, If You See My Savior, to churches throughout the country. It was 3 years before I got a single order. I felt like going back to the blues. He didn't. Gradually, his reputation grew and his work became known. In August 1932, while leading music in St. Louis, he was handed a telegram bearing the words, Your wife just died. A friend drove him through the night, and he arrived home to learn that his baby boy had also died. I began to feel that God had done me an injustice, Thomas later said. I didn't want to serve him anymore or write any more gospel songs. But the next Saturday, while alone in a friend's music room, he had a strange feeling inside, a sudden calm and quiet stillness. As my fingers began to manipulate over the keys, words began to fall in place on the melody like drops of water falling from the crevice of a rock. Precious Lord, take my hand. Lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Today, Thomas A. Dorsey is remembered as a father of gospel music and the author of hundreds of gospel songs, including his equally famous, Peace in the Valley.
I am tired. Great is thy faithfulness, from Psalm 36:5. Your mercy, O Lord, is in the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the clouds. The author of this hymn, Thomas Obadiah Chisholm, was born in a log cabin in Kentucky. He came to Christ at age 27 under the ministry of evangelist H.C. Morrison. Mr. Chisholm's health was unstable, and he alternated between bouts of illness and gainful employment, in which he did everything from journalism to insurance to evangelistic work. Through all the ups and downs, he discovered new blessings from God every morning. The third chapter of Lamentations 3 became precious to him, and I quote, "His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." He admitted there was no dramatic story behind the writing of Great is Thy Faithfulness. While serving the Lord in Vineland, New Jersey, he sent several poems to his friend musician William Runyon, who was so moved by this one that he prayed earnestly for special guidance in composing the music. Runyon was in Baldwin, Kansas at the time, and the hymn was published in 1923 in Runyon's private song pamphlets. It went rather slowly for several years, and it remained relatively unknown until popularized around the world by George Beverly Shea and the choirs at the Billy Graham Crusades. Mr. Chisholm spent his retirement years in a Methodist home for the aged in Ocean Park, New Jersey, where he was frequently seen walking by the ocean and along town streets. A resident of Ocean Park recalls his pleasant demeanor as he dropped by the diner, sat on park benches, and fellowshiped with friends at Ocean Park's summer Bible conferences. Thomas Obadiah Chisholm died in Ocean Park in 1960. During his lifetime, he wrote 1,200 poems and hymns.
The Old Rugged Cross. George Bernard was born in Youngstown, Ohio, shortly after the end of the Civil War. His father, a coal miner, moved the family to Iowa, and there George came to Christ through the ministry of the Salvation Army. He felt impressed to train for the ministry, but his plans were disrupted when his father's death left him responsible for his mother and sisters. He was 16 years old, so instead of going to theology school, he worked by day and devoted his spare time to books. Eventually, George's obligations lessened, and he was able to move to Chicago. He married, and he began in ministry with the Salvation Army. Later, he was ordained by the Methodist Episcopal Church and became a traveling evangelist. In 1913, after a difficult season of ministry, George realized that he needed to better understand the power of the cross of Christ. He later said, "I was praying for a full understanding of the cross, and I read and studied and prayed, and the leaves of the printed page take form and act out the meaning of the redemption." Well, I didn't read that right, so let me go back and start over again. He later said, "I was praying for a full understanding of the cross. I read and studied and prayed. The Christ of the cross became more of the symbol. It was like seeing John 3:16 leave the printed page, take form, and act out the meaning of redemption." While watching this scene with my mind's eye, the theme of the song came to me. Some might say that he was daydreaming, but you know, sometimes in daydreamings we have inspiration, and that's what resulted here. It took several months for the words to formulate in his mind, and he preached through the Midwest. George would carry the words with him. He worked on them and he polished them and sometimes sang them in his meetings. He always struck a chord with his audience. At last, his hymn finished, George went to the home of a friend, Reverend and Ms. L.O. Boswick, and sang it for them. After the last note, he looked at them and said, "Will it do?" And they were so moved that they helped him pay the fee to have it printed, and soon it began appearing in hymn books across America. The power of the cross of Christ. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that whosoever, not who I think should or not who you think should, but whosoever believes in him will have everlasting life. As the choir sings this hymn, let the words of this song resonate with you, that you too may get a better understanding of the power of the cross of Christ.
Stand Up for Jesus was written in 1858. Ephesians 6:14 says, Stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness. Dudley Tyne served as his father's assistant at Philadelphia Church, the Epiphany, and was elected its pastor when his father retired in 1854. He was only 29 when he succeeded his father at this large Episcopal church, and at first it seemed a great fit, but the honeymoon soon ended when Dudley began vigorously preaching against slavery. Loud complaints rose from the more conservative members, resulting in Dudley's resignation in 1856. He and his followers organized the Church of the Covenant elsewhere in the city, and his reputation grew. He began noontime Bible studies at the YMCA, and his ministry reached far beyond his own church walls. Dudley had a passion for leading husbands and fathers to Christ, and he helped organize a great rally to reach men. On Tuesday, March 30th, 1858, 5,000 men gathered. As Dudley looked over the sea of faces, he felt overwhelmed. I would rather this right arm were amputated at the trunk than that I should come short of my duty to you in delivering God's message, he told the crowd. Over 1,000 men were converted that day. 2 weeks later, Dudley was visiting the countryside, watching a corn thrasher in the barn. His hand moved too close to the machine, and his sleeve was snared. His arm was ripped from the socket, the main artery severed. 4 days later, his right arm was amputated close to the shoulder. When it appeared he was dying, Dudley told his aged father, stand up for Jesus, Father, and tell my brethren of the ministry to stand up for Jesus. Reverend George Duffield of Philadelphia's Temple Presbyterian Church was deeply stirred by Dudley's funeral, and the following Sunday he preached from Ephesians 6:14 about standing firm for Christ. He read a poem he had written, inspired by Dudley's words. Stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. The editor of a hymnal heard the poem, found appropriate music, and published it, Stand Up for Jesus. Soon became one of America's favorite hymns, extending Dudley's dying words for millions.
Stand up for Jesus.
Stand Friends are some of God's best gifts, and sometimes friendships produce great things that can last for centuries. One of these special friendships was that of Francis Crosby and Phoebe Knapp, authors of Blessed Assurance, that was written in 1873. I don't know how these two became friends or when they first met, but they're an unlikely combination. Phoebe lived in a mansion in Brooklyn and entertained lavishly. She was an extravagant dresser with a wardrobe full of elaborate gowns and diamond tiaras. Her music room contained one of the finest collection of instruments in the country. And Fanny, that's what they called Frances, was Fanny, was a frequent house guest. Fanny, on the other hand, lived in the Manhattan slums and worked in rescue missions. So one day, while Fanny was staying at the Knapp mansion, Phoebe said she had a tune she wanted to play. So they went to the music room. She sat at the piano and played a new composition of her own while Fanny listened. Fanny immediately clapped her hands and exclaimed, "Why, that says Blessed Assurance." She quickly composed the words and a great hymn was born. It's worth noting here that Fanny was blind. Another interesting fact about Fanny is that she was a pen pal of another Frances, but Frances Ridley Havergal. And Frances lived in England. Fanny lived in America. They never met, but they both became the most famous women hymnists of their age. Frances wrote this poem about her American counterpart. Sweet, blind singer over the sea, tuneful and jubilant, how can it be that the songs of gladness which float so far as if they fell from the evening star are the notes of one who may never see visible music of flower and tree? Oh, her heart can see, and its sight is strong and swift and free.
Salvation, This is In the Garden. It was by Austin Miles, and he was a pharmacist. He began writing gospel songs, and eventually he became an editor of hymnals and songbooks. But his hobby was photography, and he found his darkroom perfect for developing not just his photographs, but his devotional life. March 1912. One day in March 1912, while waiting for some film to develop, he opened the Bible to his favorite chapter, John 20. That was the Easter story. Miles later said, "As I read it that day, I seemed to be part of the scene. My hands were resting on the Bible while I stared at the light blue wall. As the light faded, I seemed to be standing at the entrance of a garden, looking down a gently winding path shadowed by olive branches. A woman in white, with head bowed, hand clasping her throat as if to choke back her sobs, walked slowly into the shadows. It was Mary. As she came to the tomb, upon which she placed her hand, she bent over to look in and hurried away. John, in flowing robe, appeared, looking at the tomb. Then came Peter, who entered the tomb, followed slowly by John. As they departed, Mary reappeared. Leaning her head upon her arm at the tomb, she wept. Turning herself, she saw Jesus standing. So did I. I knew it was he. She knelt before him. With arms outstretched and looking into his face, she cried, "Rabboni!" I awakened in full light, gripping my Bible, with muscles tense and nerves vibrating. Under the inspiration of this vision, I wrote as quickly as the words would be formed, and this poem exactly as it had appeared to me. That same evening, I wrote the music. All right, and that was Austin Miles in 1912.
I It Is Well with My Soul is one of my favorite hymns, and it's always sung wonderfully by our choir, who's going to be singing here in just a moment. But they do a great job with it. It's one of my favorites that we have here at St. Paul's. The man who wrote the words, Horatio Spafford, he was an attorney in Chicago, and he invested in a lot of real estate in that area. And he lived in Chicago, and during the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, it destroyed his home, all of his belongings, all of his investments he had there, and they had no insurance, and he lost all of his money, or most of his money. 2 years later, as he was trying to get his business back up on his feet, he was sending his family's going to go on a vacation across the ocean to England to meet some friends in the evangelical movement there in England. He had to stay behind for an urgent business matter, so he sent his wife and their 4 daughters on the boat across the ocean. A day or so into the trip, that boat ran into a steel shipping vessel, and there was 276 casualties on that shipwreck. A couple of days later, the 47 survivors arrived in Wales, and at that point, he got a telegram from his wife, and the telegram stated, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" During the shipwreck, all 4 of his daughters had been taken by the sea. So Horatio quickly boarded another ship to England, and as the ship passed over the very same place where the ocean and his daughters had drowned, across the ocean where his daughters had drowned, he wrote these words to this song. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows and roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul.
When peace like a British went through Bladensburg, they ransacked Washington, D.C., but the big prize was Baltimore. It was an international community. Went through Bladensburg, they ransacked Washington, D.C., but the big prize was Baltimore. It was an international community. British went through Bladensburg, they ransacked Washington, D.C., but the big prize was Baltimore. It was an international community, it was a deep port, it was the center of commerce.
And it's the home of a lot of the privateers that are causing the problems. Baltimore, big shipbuilding town. So it would be really nice to get into downtown Baltimore and burn their shipyards, destroy the privateers.
The star-shaped fort called McHenry at the top of the bay was the linchpin. Destroy the fort, and the city would fall. On the morning of September 13th, the British Navy attacked the fort. Bombs began bursting in air.
The British hurled 1,400 cast iron exploding shells at the fort within a 48-hour period. And that's a total of about 133 tons of exploded metal over Baltimore Harbor that could be heard, by the way, 100 miles away in downtown Philadelphia.
For all the explosions, what Americans would remember from that night was the work of a lawyer, Francis Scott Key. He watched the bombardment from a ship just 8 miles away.
Key had seen over Fort McHenry this gigantic flag flying before sunset. Throughout the night he paced the deck of his ship in the darkness, hoping the explosions would continue, because if there was silence, it might mean the fort had capitulated.
As the morning mist clears, as he says in his hymn, he saw the American flag.
And he had never looked with such reverence upon the symbol of his country. He took a letter out of his pocket, and on the back of it, jotted down thoughts, words, phrases, anything that toppled through his mind while the intensity of the moment lasted. That poem was crafted and polished, and it was sent to an old English drinking song called To an Aquarium in Heaven.
Within a week after the battle for Baltimore, the song is published. It is 4 stanzas long. Within a month, every newspaper in the United States has published it.
spurned their fierce evangelical preaching. Many pulpits were closed to them. A friend from his Oxford days, George Winfield, 22 years old, who was having the same trouble, began preaching in the open air. In London, he asked Charles to stand with him, and he preached to thousands in the open air at Blackheath. And Charles, too, got a vision for preaching to the multitudes. He made his first attempt in the outskirts of London. Franklin, a farmer, invited him to preach in the field. He wrote, "I did so about 500. I returned to the house rejoicing. Soon he was preaching to thousands. My load was gone, and all my doubts and scruples. God shone upon my path, and I knew this was his will concerning me." A man named Joseph William heard Charles in Bristol. I found him standing on a table board in an erect posture, surrounded by, I guess, more than 1,000 people. Some of them fashionable persons, but most of the lower rank of mankind. He prayed with unconscious fervence. He then preached about half an hour in such a manner as I scarce ever heard any man preach. Charles Wesley still preached today in much the same way, through his ageless hymns which we all sung around the world each Sunday. Perhaps his most exuberant anthem is the one he simply called Hymn for Easter Day.
Amen. next hymn is Silent Night, and it was written in 1818. It's based on biblical scripture from Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and call his name Emmanuel. It was Christmas Eve in the Austrian Alps at a newly constructed church of St. Nicholas in Oberndorf, a Tyrol village near Salzburg. Father Joseph Moore prepared for the midnight service. He was distraught because the church organ was broken, ruining his prospects for that evening's carefully planned music. But Father Joseph was about to learn that our problems are God's opportunities, that the Lord causes all things to work together for good to those who love him. It came into Father Joseph's mind to write a new song, one that could be sung organless. Hastily he wrote the words, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." Taking the text to his organist, Franz Gruber, he explained the situation and asked Franz to compose a simple tune. That night, December the 24th, 1818, almost 200 years ago, Silent Night was sung for the first time as a duet accompanied by a guitar at the aptly named Church of St. Nicholas in Oberndorf. The song came to the attention of the Strasser family, makers of fine chamois-skinned gloves, to drum up business at their various fairs and festivals. The four Strasser children would sing in front of their parents' booth, and they quickly became very popular folk singers throughout the Alps. And they even gave a royal performance to the king and queen. Silent Night was first published for congregational singing in 1838 in a German hymn book, and it was brought to America and sung in the English form in a book of Sunday school songs in 1863. Were it not for a broken organ, there would never have been a silent night.
Oh
Our final hymn is "The Lord Bless You and Keep You." It's a 14th century BC tune. The Dead Sea Scrolls were until recently our oldest copies of biblical text. But in 1979, Villanova professor Judith Hadley was assisting archaeologist Gabriel Barclay in excavating a site in Jerusalem's Hinnom Valley. In a burial cave, she saw something resembling a metal cap of a pencil. It was a sensational find. It was a tiny silver scroll of great antiquity. Another was found nearby. These tiny amulets, dating to the Hebrew monarchy, 7 centuries before Christ, were so small and fragile that they took years to painstakingly clean and open. When scientists finally unrolled them, they found the world's oldest extant copy of biblical text. The words of Numbers 6:24 through 26, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." And while the amulets date from the 7th century BC, the original words are far older, coming 1400 years before Christ. As the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, the Lord commanded the priest to bless the people with a threefold blessing. In his notes from my Bible, D.L. Moody said about the priestly blessing of number 6, "Here is a benediction that can give all the time without being impoverished. Every heart may utter it. Every letter may conclude with it. Every date may begin with it. Every night may be sanctified by it." Here is a blessing, keeping, shining, the uplifting upon our poor life all of heaven's glad morning. This is the Lord himself who gives us this bar of music from heaven's infinite anthem.